West frames nihilism not as a momentary sadness but as a pervasive spiritual sickness that seeps into the daily fabric of life, eroding meaning the same way rust eats metal, slowly, invisibly, and irreversibly unless treated. This sickness is not merely an absence of hope, it is an active hunger for significance that cannot be satisfied by the usual consolations of fame, money, or fleeting pleasures. When meaning collapses, people don't just feel sad, they start to interpret every experience through a lens of emptiness, so successes feel hollow and suffering feels interminable. The moral imagination shrinks, ethical obligations become negotiable, and the self's narrative, the story one tells about why one matters, disintegrates into fragments. For Black Americans, West insists, this erosion is rooted in a long history of dehumanization, centuries in which voices were silenced, bodies commodified, families torn, and cultural achievements ignored or stolen. Those historical wounds do not vanish with legal reforms, they leave psychic scars and institutional patterns that persist across generations. The experience of repeated betrayal by institutions, schools that undereducate, courts that discriminate, neighborhoods that are neglected, produces a sense that the social contract is a sham for some citizens. When the promise of equal membership in civic life proves unreliable, faith in justice itself weakens and cynicism becomes a rational, though tragic, posture. West is careful to show that nihilism is not only an individual pathology but also a communal one. It spreads through neighborhoods when structures that nurture life, families, religious communities, civic organizations, are weakened. Communal rituals, storytelling, and shared moral practices ordinarily give people reasons for living. When those institutions fray, the communal glue that binds people to mutual care dissolves. The cultural economy compounds the problem by offering substitutes for meaning that are ultimately counterfeit. Celebrity, consumerism, and spectacle provide temporary distraction but not durable purpose. When identity becomes tethered to what one consumes or how one is seen, existential depth is sacrificed on the altar of visibility. Add to that the corrosive influence of violence and trauma. Surviving chronic exposure to violence rewires moral perception. Danger becomes normative and the boundary between self-protection and moral compromise blurs. Trauma also narrows the future horizon. When tomorrow feels precarious, long-term commitments such as education, civic engagement, or family building feel like luxuries. Nihilism then becomes a force that reconfigures priorities. Immediate survival tactics replace long-term investments in flourishing, and the moral vocabulary shifts from ought to how to get by, how to score, how to numb the pain. This pragmatism is understandable, but it is morally impoverishing because it excludes reflection on the good life. West refuses to reduce the problem to psychology alone. He emphasizes the political dimensions. Policies that create concentrated poverty, mass incarceration that decimates communities, and economic systems that extract value without reinvesting in people are structural enablers of nihilism. Thus, meaningful resistance must be both spiritual and political. Fixing internal despair without fixing external injustice is insufficient, and vice versa. The critique of leadership is central. When public figures trade prophetic moral clarity for charisma without substance, they fail to offer compelling narratives of dignity. West mourns the loss of leaders who blend moral courage with practical organizing, and he warns that hollow leadership intensifies nihilism by offering imitation rather than inspiration. The critique of leadership is central. When public figures trade prophetic moral clarity for charisma without substance, they fail to offer compelling narratives of dignity. West mourns the loss of leaders who blend moral courage with practical organizing, and he warns that hollow leadership intensifies nihilism by offering imitation rather than inspiration. Education plays a pivotal role in either deepening or healing nihilism. Curricula that ignore cultural contributions, that teach by rote rather than cultivate critical and moral reflection, contribute to a sense of irrelevance. Conversely, education that foregrounds agency, history, and moral reasoning can rebuild the scaffolding for meaningful life projects. West's solution is profoundly relational. Love, understood not sentimentally but as the commitment to the other's flourishing, is the antidote to spiritual emptiness. Love, in this register, calls for concrete practices, listening, mentoring, creating spaces of refuge, that slowly reconstruct a sense of worth. This ethic of love requires institutions that embody care, strong families, vibrant churches, community centers, and cultural outlets that restore narrative. These institutions must not be romanticized, they need resources, honest leadership, and accountability to become effective bulwarks against nihilism. Art and culture also have remedial power because they shape imagination. Stories, music, and visual art can reconnect people to larger meanings and histories, modeling resilience and reframing suffering as part of a collective story that includes possibility. Cultural work can dramatize dignity in ways policy cannot, providing emotional entry points for ethical renewal. But West warns against facile optimism. The struggle against nihilism is not a one-off campaign, it is a long, often painful effort requiring personal sacrifice and communal persistence. Hope, for West, is neither naive nor resigned, it is a disciplined practice sustained by moral witnesses and rituals that reaffirm purpose. The prophetic tradition of Black thought offers exemplars who fused critique with constructive imagination. Those figures did not merely indict injustice, they articulated visions of a renewed democratic life. West calls contemporary actors to reclaim that prophetic role, to diagnose, to lament, and to point toward concrete practices of transformation. Reclaiming meaning also entails confronting internalized self-contempt, the pernicious belief that one is less deserving of dignity. Therapeutic practices, public acknowledgement of harms, and spaces for collective mourning help break the cycle of shame that perpetuates despair. Economically, West insists, meaningful opportunity must replace extractive arrangements. Living wage work, equitable schooling, and community investment create material conditions in which people can make commitments to future projects. When people can plan and hope, they can imagine themselves as actors in their own stories rather than as passive recipients of chance. Finally, West's account is animated by moral urgency. Nihilism is not an abstract concept but a lived emergency demanding both compassion and structural change. Healing requires intellectual clarity, moral courage, and communal tenderness, a politics of conversion that reorients hearts while transforming institutions so that Black lives are not just tolerated but honored and cherished. Cornel West begins this section by insisting that nihilism in Black America cannot be understood apart from its historical roots. It is not a new phenomenon or a spontaneous moral collapse, it is the culmination of centuries of structural degradation and moral betrayal. Every form of despair that exists today, he suggests, is an echo of some earlier form of oppression that was never fully confronted or healed. Slavery stands at the foundation of this spiritual crisis. It did not only enslave bodies but also sought to enslave meaning, to convince generations of Black people that their lives existed solely for the profit, pleasure, and control of others. When human beings are treated as property, their capacity to construct purpose and self-worth is violently disrupted. That original assault on dignity became the seed of a lingering existential wound. After the abolition of slavery, freedom was proclaimed in law but rarely practiced in life. The post-Civil War Reconstruction period briefly promised a moral rebirth, but its collapse left a vacuum that was filled by terror, segregation, and disenfranchisement. The Jim Crow system functioned as a social machine designed to preserve the psychological architecture of slavery, the conviction that Black life was disposable and inferior. The persistence of that hierarchy embedded despair in daily existence. Segregation was not simply about separate facilities, it was about separate destinies. Black schools, neighborhoods, and hospitals were underfunded, and mobility was structurally restricted. Every closed door reminded Black citizens that the promise of equality was hollow. Over time, exclusion hardened into expectation, and expectation became self-perpetuating hopelessness. Economic oppression intertwined with racial oppression to produce a double bind. The rise of industrial capitalism offered work but not freedom, and when industries declined, unemployment rose sharply in Black communities. Generations of people were trapped in cycles of low wages, temporary jobs, and inadequate housing. Poverty, in West's analysis, was not accidental, it was the economic continuation of racial subjugation. The civil rights movement marked a moral awakening, but it could not fully undo centuries of systemic neglect. Legal victories opened doors for some, but the majority of Black Americans remained confined within economic and educational structures that reproduced inequality. The promised freedom after the movement often meant access without security, entry into a world still unwilling to share its wealth and power. As factories left cities and deindustrialization swept across urban America, black workers were the first to lose stable employment. The disappearance of manufacturing jobs eroded family stability, community networks, and the sense of a collective future. West calls this transformation a spiritual blackout, a period when the lights of purpose and faith dimmed across entire neighborhoods. Neglect by government institutions deepened this darkness. Public housing projects became warehouses for the poor, while schools deteriorated and social programs were cut. Policymakers spoke of personal responsibility but ignored the systemic design that deprived communities of resources. Neglect, West argues, is a subtler form of violence, one that kills hope through slow starvation rather than sudden attack. The culture of survival that emerged from these conditions was not chosen freely, it was forced by necessity. Families learned to make do with scarcity, to guard what little they had, and to mistrust institutions that had betrayed them for generations. Survival became the central ethic, pushing aside the expansive dreams that freedom was supposed to make possible. When a people live too long in survival mode, their moral imagination narrows. The horizon of possibility contracts to the next paycheck, the next meal, the next day without catastrophe. In this state, West sees nihilism taking hold, not because people are inherently broken, but because their environment has drained them of the energy to imagine otherwise. Racism in this context becomes not only a matter of prejudice but of institutional design. Housing policies, lending practices, school zoning, and policing strategies all interact to reproduce despair. West describes this as structural neglect, a deliberate absence of care that functions as a form of domination. It's not hatred that sustains inequality now, but indifference. That indifference reaches beyond policy and into the cultural psyche of America. The dominant narrative celebrates progress while refusing to face the continuity of pain. When the larger society insists that equality has been achieved, those still suffering feel unseen and invalidated. This denial intensifies the sense of futility that defines nihilism. Media representations reinforce this alienation. Urban poverty is portrayed as moral failure rather than structural abandonment, and black suffering becomes entertainment or political talking points. When stories of resilience are ignored and stories of violence are amplified, entire communities are framed as problems to be solved rather than people to be understood. The collapse of credible leadership after the civil rights era also contributed to the vacuum. Many public figures drifted toward corporate interests or shallow symbolism, leaving few moral voices capable of articulating collective meaning. Without prophetic leadership, leaders willing to tell uncomfortable truths, despair festers in silence. West insists that even religion, which once offered refuge, has been weakened by commodification and hypocrisy. Churches that were once centers of justice and hope often succumb to the allure of prosperity preaching or political compromise. The moral power that sustained resistance was diluted by consumer values that mirrored the very systems of oppression they once challenged. All of these forces combine to create a spiritual blackout, a condition in which communities function but do not flourish. People wake, work, and struggle, yet the collective sense of direction is lost. There is motion without progress, activity without meaning. In such a world, cynicism appears rational and hope naive. West refuses, however, to interpret this only as tragedy. He sees in the recognition of historical roots a possibility for renewal. When despair is traced to its structural origins, it ceases to appear as a personal flaw and instead becomes a call for justice. Understanding history, in his view, is the first step toward reclaiming moral agency. The legacy of slavery and segregation, then, must be confronted not only politically but spiritually. Healing demands more than policy reform, it requires truth-telling, mourning, and collective remembrance. By facing history honestly, a community can transform inherited wounds into sources of solidarity rather than shame. Ultimately, West argues that America's neglect of black suffering is a mirror reflecting its own moral decay. A nation that allows spiritual blackout to persist in any corner of its society endangers its democratic soul. The path forward lies in acknowledging how deeply the past lives in the present, and in refusing to confuse survival with freedom. Facing systemic despair, communities often adopt cultural responses that promise relief but deliver only temporary respite. Materialism offers an image of success that seems accessible. If you can buy the look, you can buy dignity. That promise is intoxicating precisely because it appears immediate and controllable, unlike structural change which requires collective time and effort. Consumer culture fills the silence left by diminished institutions. Advertisements and media narratives teach that identity is constructed through purchases. Cars, clothes, electronics become shorthand for worth. This externalization of value shifts attention away from communal bonds and toward personal branding, making relationships transactional. When consumption becomes the primary language of value, the moral vocabulary that once grounded community life erodes. Traditions, solidarities, and commitments that used to generate meaning are sidelined. People begin to measure success by visibility and accumulation rather than by contributions to the common good or the flourishing of others. Escapism takes many forms beyond shopping. Recreational drugs and alcohol provide immediate numbing of pain and anxiety, and for many they are self-prescribed medicine in environments where mental health care is scarce or stigmatized. Substance use thus becomes both symptom and strategy, an attempt to survive psychological overload but also a practice that deepens social fragmentation. Violence and bravado can also be forms of escapism. When a person's future feels blocked, asserting dominance or engaging in risky behavior may temporarily rearrange social status, offering a brittle sense of control. Such actions, however, isolate individuals from stable networks of care and invite cycles of retaliation and trauma. Media industries amplify and monetize these reactions. Reality television, music videos, and social platforms often reward spectacle over substance, rewarding those who display wealth, aggression, or scandal. This selective amplification normalizes a narrow set of aspirations and flattens the moral complexity of human life into consumable moments. The celebrity model presented by media confers legitimacy on lifestyles that are rarely sustainable or authentic for most people. Young audiences internalize the belief that fame equates to fulfillment, and they learn to perform identity for approval. Performance becomes substitute for intimacy, and the hunger for likes replaces the hunger for meaningful connection. This cultural script discourages deep reflection about systemic causes. If success is framed as individual achievement by consumption, structural explanations for poverty and marginalization become less visible. Blame shifts inward, reinforcing narratives of personal failure rather than prompting collective responsibility or policy interventions. Materialism also reshapes values within families and peer groups. Parenting under economic strain can devolve into prioritizing immediate comforts, gadgets, clothes, status markers, over long-term investments like education, mentorship, or civic involvement. These short-term concessions incrementally reorient what children come to view as possible and desirable. The commodification of pleasure corrodes spiritual practices that once offered resilience. Rituals, communal worship, and shared cultural events are time-honored sources of meaning. When leisure time is monopolized by consumption or entertainment, those practices lose their vitality and reach fewer people. The loss is not only recreational but existential. Art and culture have the power to resist materialism, but when cultural production itself is driven by market logic, countervailing narratives struggle to break through. Artists who critique consumerism may be marginalized or asked to package dissent as palatable spectacle, diluting the critical edge that could foster collective reflection and change. Escapism thrives where hope is scarce because it provides immediate feedback and a semblance of reward. The human mind is wired to prefer short-term relief in the face of uncertainty. Without visible pathways to improvement, many understandably opt for the comfort of immediate gratification. That choice, repeated at scale, becomes a social pattern. The substitution of community love with selfish desire has political consequences. Civic participation declines when people are absorbed by private consumption and entertainment. Voting, organizing, and volunteering require an investment of attention and trust that is harder to muster when cultural attention is constantly diverted to private gain. Economic inequality intensifies the dynamics of materialism. When a few model extravagant lifestyles and media circulate those images incessantly, they generate envy and a sense of inadequacy. For those shut out of legitimate economic pathways, imitation can become a compensatory strategy, reinforcing cycles of debt and precarious work. Escapism as a cultural response also intersects with mental health in complex ways. Constant exposure to curated lives on social media fuels comparison and low self-esteem, while the normalization of numbing behaviors delays recognition of deeper trauma. Without accessible therapeutic frameworks, suffering is privatized and hidden rather than addressed publicly. Commercial interests benefit from keeping people dependent on consumption as identity. Economies are structured to convert dissatisfaction into demand, and this creates incentives for industries to stoke insecurities rather than alleviate them. The result is a market that profits from spiritual lack rather than fostering human thriving. Resistance to this cultural tide requires rebuilding alternative sources of meaning. Community arts, cooperative enterprises, faith-based solidarity, and restorative education can re-anchor identity in collective purposes. These alternatives are not mere nostalgia, they are practical infrastructures for restoring dignity and agency. Cultivating public narratives that celebrate resilience, craftsmanship, mutual aid, and civic contribution can counter the narrow scripts of success. Storytelling that honors ordinary acts of courage and care helps reshape the imagination of what a good life looks like beyond material acquisition and fame. Ultimately, West warns that materialism and escapism do not merely distract from political struggle, they actively undermine the ethical foundations needed for sustained resistance. When people are taught to seek solace in things rather than in one another, the bonds that make collective action possible begin to fray, and nihilism finds fertile ground. Cornel West insists that the crisis of nihilism cannot be solved by politics alone because it is not only a social or economic issue, it is a crisis of the soul. He argues that when a people lose meaning, when their hearts are drained of purpose, no policy or program can fill that emptiness. What is needed first is a moral and spiritual awakening, a rediscovery of love, empathy, and human connection that restores faith in one another. Love, in West's philosophy, is not sentimental or naive. It is a radical act of recognition. To love someone is to see them fully, to affirm their worth even when society denies it. For a community that has endured centuries of dehumanization, love becomes a revolutionary force. It breaks through the lies of inferiority and rebuilds dignity from within. Empathy flows naturally from love, but it also demands humility. Empathy requires one to listen deeply, to understand pain that is not one's own, and to allow that understanding to shape moral action. West teaches that empathy transforms suffering into solidarity. It turns personal wounds into bridges between people who might otherwise remain divided by race, class, or fear. He reminds us that nihilism feeds on isolation. When people feel unseen or unloved, despair grows. The antidote, therefore, is not only structural justice but also a revival of care. Care must be cultivated at every level of life, within families, schools, neighborhoods, and cultural institutions, so that individuals feel anchored in belonging. Families, West says, are the first moral schools of love. They teach patience, sacrifice, and respect for life's sacredness. But in communities torn apart by poverty and neglect, families are often overwhelmed. That is why he urges society to support family life, not through moral judgment, but through compassion and resources that strengthen the capacity to love under pressure. Churches and faith traditions, for West, play a special role in healing the spirit. The Black Church, in particular, has historically been a sanctuary for broken souls and a center of political resistance. It teaches that faith is not passive belief but active hope, a conviction that freedom is possible even when evidence says otherwise. This prophetic faith, he argues, must be rekindled to resist the despair that nihilism spreads. Artists, too, are central to West's vision of renewal. Art has the power to tell the truth in ways that laws and speeches cannot. It touches the conscience and imagination at once. Music, poetry, painting, and performance can reveal hidden beauty in the struggle and remind people of their shared humanity. In the rhythm of jazz, the cry of gospel, and the poetry of resistance, West finds the sound of survival and moral rebirth. Activists embody the moral courage that turns empathy into movement. They refuse to accept despair as destiny. By organizing, protesting, and building community alternatives, activists show that moral conviction can become public power. Their example teaches others that love is not weak, it is the foundation of justice. West uses the phrase, "a politics of conversion," to describe this process. He means that political change must be accompanied by a change of heart. Reform without conversion only rearranges structures, it does not heal souls. Conversion, on the other hand, transforms people from the inside out. It calls them to act with integrity, humility, and compassion. He warns against the illusion that money or prestige can substitute for moral depth. A society obsessed with profit cannot cultivate love because everything becomes transactional. To overcome nihilism, people must reclaim values that cannot be bought: trust, honesty, service, and the willingness to care for those who can offer nothing in return. Education, in this moral framework, is not merely about skills but about character. West envisions schools as places where children learn empathy, moral reasoning, and civic courage alongside reading and math. Without moral education, he says, intelligence becomes cunning and talent becomes manipulation. True education forms citizens who can love justice more than comfort. Hope, for West, is the spiritual companion of love. It is not blind optimism but a disciplined faith that goodness is still possible. Hope refuses to let despair have the last word. It tells the oppressed that they are more than victims and the privileged that they are more than consumers. It invites everyone into the hard work of building a beloved community. This beloved community, a term borrowed from Martin Luther King Jr., represents West's ultimate vision. It is a society rooted in care rather than competition, in shared purpose rather than individual gain. It requires both moral imagination and political courage, the ability to envision a just world and the will to make it real. Forgiveness also plays a part in this spiritual healing. West does not mean forgetting injustice, rather, he speaks of forgiveness as liberation from hatred. Resentment, he warns, poisons the spirit and strengthens nihilism. Forgiveness allows individuals and communities to move forward without surrendering truth or accountability. Community programs, local mentorships, and grassroots initiatives embody the spirit of love in action. These are the spaces where people rediscover mutual responsibility and dignity. West celebrates the unsung heroes who feed the hungry, mentor youth, or create safe spaces for dialogue. They are the quiet warriors against nihilism. Spirituality, as West describes it, is not confined to religion. It is the human hunger for meaning, the desire to connect with something larger than oneself. Whether through prayer, art, activism, or reflection, spirituality nourishes the soul's resistance to despair. It reminds people that life, despite pain, remains sacred. He calls on leaders, political, religious, and cultural, to model moral integrity. Leadership without compassion deepens cynicism. True leaders, he says, must love the people they serve and be willing to suffer for the truth. Their example becomes the moral compass for a generation adrift in materialism and confusion. West's vision of love and care is profoundly democratic. It demands participation from everyone, not just elites or activists. Every act of kindness, every honest conversation, every effort to uplift others contributes to the moral reconstruction of society. Democracy, he insists, lives or dies in the everyday choices of ordinary people. Ultimately, Cornel West's message is that love is the most radical political act because it restores humanity where nihilism seeks to destroy it. Love opens the possibility of healing, of community, and of moral clarity in a world often clouded by fear and greed. It is not an escape from struggle but the very energy that sustains it. When West calls for a politics of conversion, he is inviting each listener to begin within themselves. The revolution he envisions starts in the heart, with the courage to love, the humility to care, and the conviction to act. That is how the human spirit overcomes nihilism, not through power or wealth, but through the everyday miracle of love in action. Cornel West closes his analysis not with resignation but with a defiant affirmation: hope is not a passive feeling but an active, moral stance. He locates this hope in the Black prophetic tradition, a lineage of voices who refused to let oppression harden them into cynics and who instead named suffering while also naming a future in which justice and human dignity could flourish. The prophetic tradition, for West, is exemplified by figures who combined moral clarity with courageous action. They did not offer simple consolation, they issued biting critiques of power while simultaneously crafting visions of redemption. In their practice, hope and critique were inseparable. Hope gave direction to protest, and protest kept hope honest. Hope in this mode is not naive optimism. It does not ignore pain or pretend that injustice can be wished away. Rather, it recognizes suffering fully and then refuses to be defined solely by it. This refusal is itself an act of courage, to say that despite history and present harms, a different story is possible. Love is central to the prophetic horizon. But West insists that this love is not sentimental, it is demanding, costly, and public. Love here calls for solidarity with the afflicted, willingness to sacrifice, and a commitment to the common good. It is love that sustains the long haul of struggle, preventing activism from dissolving into mere outrage or despair. Faith operates alongside love as a sustaining force. Faith, in West's sense, is less about dogma and more about a disciplined trust that moral effort can change conditions. It is faith that supports persistent organizing when immediate victories are rare, and it is faith that helps communities rehearse a future that contradicts present realities. Struggle is the practical expression of this hope. Hope without struggle becomes passive, struggle without hope becomes nihilistic. The prophetic outlook fuses the two. It channels righteous anger into disciplined forms of collective action aimed at transforming institutions and hearts alike. In resisting despair, the prophetic tradition also cultivates moral imagination. It insists on telling different stories about who we are and who we might be. Narrative work is political work. The images, songs, and testimonies that communities produce shape what people expect of themselves and one another, and thus shape possible futures. Prophetic hope also refuses to personalize failure. It locates responsibility in systems and structures while preserving the agency of individuals. This balanced stance prevents the slide into blame, either of entire peoples or of impotent structures, and instead calls for accountable action that addresses root causes. Hope as resistance requires witnesses, people who model integrity and endurance. The presence of elders, truth-tellers, artists, and organizers who embody commitment matters tremendously. Witnesses transmit moral memory, pass down strategies of resilience, and show younger generations that a life invested in justice is viable. The prophetic tradition also practices lament. Lament is not resignation but an ethical and communal way of mourning what was lost while recommitting to repair. Through lament, communities acknowledge trauma honestly and refuse the quick fixes that obscure deeper wounds. Hope must be institutionalized to have lasting effect. Churches, schools, unions, and civic associations can become vessels of prophetic practice when they center dignity, justice, and care. Institutional forms that teach responsibility and cultivate solidarity help translate moments of courage into enduring capacity. Yet institutions can betray as well as heal. Prophetic hope requires constant critique of institutions that stray from their moral purpose. The prophetic impulse is always a corrective force, calling institutions back to the values that animate them and criticizing those that have become complacent or complicit. Art and culture play indispensable roles in sustaining prophetic hope. Art reaches the imagination before policy does. It can dramatize suffering and possibility in ways that move hearts and mobilize people. Songs, poems, visual works, and stories help maintain the emotional stamina needed for long struggles. Education under prophetic terms is formative rather than merely instrumental. It teaches critical thinking, moral courage, historical memory, and civic responsibility. A prophetic pedagogy prepares citizens not only to succeed individually but to participate in collective renewal. Hope resists despair by naming dignity as non-negotiable. To maintain hope is to insist that certain things, bodily safety, meaningful work, respect, are not commodities but rights. This insistence reshapes political priorities and reorients moral imagination toward the possibility of a decent society for all. Prophetic hope is also intergenerational. It refuses shortcuts that sacrifice the future for present comfort. Activism guided by prophetic hope invests in young people, builds institutions slowly, and thinks in terms of lifetimes rather than election cycles. Accountability is part of hope's discipline. Prophetic voices demand consistency between means and ends. Tactics that replicate domination cannot be the basis of a liberated society. Hopeful struggle tests methods against the moral ends they aim to realize. Hope as resistance requires allies beyond the immediate community. Solidarity across lines of race, class, gender, and nation strengthens movements and demonstrates the universal stake in defeating nihilism. Building such alliances is difficult, but prophetic practice models how to do it with humility and reciprocity. Ultimately, West's prophetic hope is a call to remain human in an often inhuman world. It affirms that dignity and decency are worth fighting for, that moral courage is teachable, and that the soul's recovery is both personal and collective. In this register, every act of love, every episode of courage, becomes a strand in the net that holds a community